Welcome to Propaganda Loves You, the show that asks and answers the question, what do you call mass incarceration with a mascot? I'm your host, Arthur, joined by Kodie and Joe. Let's get into it.
Ask not what country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country.
We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
What do you call mass incarceration with a mascot? Alligator Alcatraz. You might laugh. You're meant to. It sounds absurd, but that is the point. Alligator Alcatraz is the nickname now widely used for an ICE detention site in Florida. It's a cartoonish, alliterative, and grotesquely effective name, and it serves to transform state violence into something that you can laugh at. This episode is all about how language does that, how it blurs harm, how it softens cruelty, and it sells disappearance as public policy. From cutesy names to sterile legalese, we're tracing how language becomes propaganda. And we're also going to ask, what would it look like to resist this? Not just the camps, but the vocabulary that hides within this policy that you see in news headlines. Across the country, organizers and abolitionists are refusing to soften the terms. They're taking a hard stance, and they call these places, what they are, concentration camps, and they're fighting for that framing. We're talking about language as propaganda, from cute names to bureaucratic terms and global strategies of erasure. So let's dive into it this week.
Love it so far.
Okay. To understand how language operates as a tool of power, we need to begin by going into two distinct but foundational thinkers in the philosophy of language. We have Ludwig and Michel Foucault. And these two are people that I've studied and really powerful, foundational, philosophic leaders. Some kind of background on Wittgenstein, which you can totally take out, but I kind of think it's, kind of interesting. He was born to one of the wealthiest families in Austro-Hungary. He volunteered for World War I, and he became a prisoner of war. And while a prisoner of war, he actually started writing his first big piece of work, his masterpiece called the Tractatus Logic. So he became a prisoner of war and wrote his masterpiece, Tractatus Logico Philosophicus. And in it, he actually starts it with
Sorry, did you say philosophagus? Is that what?
Philosophicus. These are using.
Philosophagus. It sounds like a dinosaur.
Definitely.
Okay.
And it is a dinosaur at this point.
Yeah. He starts the work. The first sentence is so esoteric and I don't know. It's the world is everything that is the case. And then he proceeds to spend 70 pages going through what a sentence is very systematically. Exactly what is a sentence? So what is language and how it mirrors reality and how a sentence is our reality. And that's okay. So Bertrand Russell, who's over at Oxford at the time, reads this and he says, I don't understand it, but it's good enough for a PhD from Oxford. So that's kind of we don't really know what he's talking about. But that's all to say that in the middle of the guy's life, Wittgenstein has an entirely different opinion and a total change of heart of what language is. He no longer thinks that it mirrors reality, but he thinks that language is I guess it's not fixed meanings or communication, but Wittgenstein, breaks from that and he sees language as a living social activity. For him, language is not about labeling objects. It's about how words are used within specific contexts, which he labels and calls language games. And he kind of goes through this metaphor where two workers are working on a house and they have these words like slab and concrete, and the two together are kind of in this language game. It's very relevant to just them, where somebody can say the word slab and the other person knows the context that that's an instruction. Hand me the slab, this goes next, whatever. So we see that the meaning of words comes from the roles that it play, the role that it plays in our interactions and rules and social norms. So in other words, meaning isn't just found in the dictionary, it's found in how people use them and command them and justify and obscure them every day. Michel Foucault, who's a French philosopher and historian and has some really interesting kind of genealogical takes on the history of like things from like sexuality to prisons to how we, relate to different identities in ourselves and the biopolitical powers that we have. He takes it a step further and he argues that language doesn't just reflect power, but it creates and it enforces power. Institutions like schools and prisons and governments use language to decide what is sayable, who is normal, what kind of violence can be rationalized. So together, these thinkers show us that language is inherently political. It's not just communication, it is control. And institutions use language to define what's real, what's normal. And so when we hear, processing center instead of detention camp, or ICE air instead of deportation flight, or evacuation instead of forced removal, we don't hear these polite, we're not just hearing polite substitutions. They're deliberate acts of framing meant to blur and recast brutality as procedure. In 2020, ICE described a mass raid as a, quote, targeted enforcement action. No mention of, their families being torn apart or legal rights trampled or lasting trauma. It's just enforcement. And that's the strategy, to remove the subject and depersonalize the act. And it makes us all kind of like shrug or become just numb to these atrocities. And so I guess my general conversing question here is that if we call these what they are, camps, is that going to change how we interact with them? Would we tolerate them? Would we have more public outcry? What do you guys think?
Yeah, I love this context too. It's such a good way to set it up and just get us in the right frame of thinking about what language is doing in these situations. When you're talking about the language game specifically, and you were talking about the two people building the house together, I thought of another example that maybe anyone with a pet or with a child probably can relate to. You have like home signs that you do with your young child before they can learn to talk. Like you create little signs with them or with your pet. Like my sign for sit for my dog might be different from the sign you use for sit. You might use a different word or a hand gesture or whatever, and you're creating a little game within your home. And that becomes the linguistic reality for your pet or your child for the time being. And like you can just see how that gets expanded to a larger and larger scale and how it works at this level. Detention center, enforcement policy versus, these other things. There's also the idea of euphemisms and dysphemisms. We've probably heard of a euphemism, which is making something sound nicer than it actually is. A dysphemism is the opposite of making something sound harsher than it actually is. And the sweet spot is right there where reality is. Like, what exactly is going on here? I think forced removal is a very accurate thing to say, especially in a lot of these cases where people are getting taken to a place that has never been in any meaningful way any kind of home to them. We like to think of deportation as, oh, they're just going back to where they came from. No, that's not really the case. Some people are getting sent places they have no idea about. They don't know the language, they don't know the culture, they don't know anybody. How do you describe that kind of cruelty? What do we call that? I don't know.
Extraordinary rendition. They're just grabbing people, kidnapping them from places, and then sending them to black sites in countries outside the United States that have no affiliation with them. I mean, that's essentially what they're doing, with no due process. And like, I was thinking as you were talking through that, Joe, like the language of detention versus kidnapping. And what came to mind was just the recent images from the raid on the farm in California. It was like, if you haven't seen it, I'd look up the images for that, because it's literally like, I don't know how many, but a bunch of ICE guys like in military fatigues looking like they're about to go to combat in Iraq or something like that, firing tear gas into a field and then trying to round up basically all of the workers there. You're not going after targeted individuals. Like that's like, they keep saying they're like, oh no, we're only going after criminals, and like it's a 70% criminal like that we're arresting. That's a lie. There's no other word for that other than a lie. You're trying to fill kidnap quotas is what you're trying to do.
It's also like, I agree with you that it is a lie, but from their point of view, it's not a lie in the sense that they've created this language game that is our society, where criminality is defined within the context of the institutions that control everything. And, loitering has been a crime. Vagrancy has been a crime. You can define criminality, like even that language, criminality, gets used to justify a lot. Like they're using it for that reason. And so we kind of have to reject the language game they're trying to play with us and create one that makes more sense, that's based on better values. Like, these are human beings who do the labor that produces most of our food that we eat. If you go to the grocery, I live in Maryland. I was trying to find strawberries that were not produced in California, and I couldn't find them. All the strawberries are made in California, right? And so these people are doing the labor that produces all the food we eat, and they're getting rounded up and targeted based on ethnicity, largely, right? If you seem vaguely Latin, you're a target for ICE right now, right? That's kind of what they mean by targeting, although they won't come out and say that, but that's what they're doing. They're targeting Latin communities and kidnapping them and taking them out of the country. And that's supposed to help people how? What does that do? Is that going to help food prices in this country? Or what do we think is going to happen there? Like, what good is this doing for anyone?
I was going to say it's a cynical take, but it's not even a cynical take. That book that I've mentioned a few times, it's the Minority Rule. Like, it talks through exactly why this is, it was written obviously before all this took place, but it kind of predicted this, right? Like, that the voter base increases as people get more Democratic, and the Democratic Party base was expanding. Like, the Republican base saw, like, we can't compete with our policies, so we need to find ways of ensuring that we can retain power through other means. And that's where gerrymandering comes in. It's where all the voter restriction IDs come in. It's where all that comes from. And then this is just a continuation of that, like removing all these people from the country that they perceive as not being part of their base or not being aligned with their values or interests, right? Anyway, that was a little bit of a tangent, but yeah.
That makes sense.
Please stay tuned for a word from our sponsors.
At Heritage Vault, we know your kids are being exposed to harmful language. Terms like colonialism, racism, and mass incarceration. Really?
My daughter asked what a concentration camp is. I told her it's a processing lodge, but honestly, I'd prefer a curriculum that handles the parenting for me.
That's why we made Words That Work, a patriotic K-12 language arts program. Genocide becomes civilization recalibration. Child labor becomes patriotic apprenticeship.
And now featuring Alligator Alcatraz, where students learn that detention centers are really just fenced opportunity zones.
Words at Work is not accredited by any known academic institution, may cause linguistic amnesia or sudden authoritarian sympathies. I think you're both kind of touching on where I was going to take it next, which is talking about the idea of bureaucracy and the system of power that it kind of has in this. You know, it's like state violence doesn't always, it's not always screaming, and it's not always so obvious where, you know, it's like, I like a big thought experiment that I've gone through when people talk to me about history. You know, it's like oftentimes people talk about like, oh, you know, would you kill Hitler if Hitler was a baby in front of you? And all the time too, there's like a narrative of like, oh, if you were in like, you know, the late 30s and you heard like, oh, these Germans have these concentration camps, I'd rush over there and I'd go help them and free them, as though like that's like the agency that one human could have on planet Earth. But anyway, that is to just kind of talk about how bureaucracy can reduce people's agency and give way to things that can arise. You know, I guess Hannah Arendt calls this like banality of evil, wherein when she covered like the Nazi trials and Adolf Eichmann, what shocked her was that he was such a bureaucratic rule follower. And the phrase banality of evil refers to the pattern where when violence is embedded in systems, people no longer feel responsible for what they're a part of, like these ICE agents who do not identify themselves and mask themselves. And you see these videos online where they actually taunt people, or they do kind of grotesque acts of violence against people, even though that goes outside their job description. Maybe not their private job description that they're getting in meetings, but like publicly it goes against what they should be doing. So humor, bureaucracy, and silence are kind of like this trio where they don't just like, accompany cruelty, but they help sustain it. And so when we name like a detention center Alligator Alcatraz, it softens the blow, it adds a wink, and it lets the public laugh instead of like leading to intervention. And the joke becomes like armor for the institution. But it's not, just humor. It's like bureaucracy is literally the machinery, the sterile terms. It's like the monitoring programs, the temporary shelters or custodial holds. They're not just technicalities. It's like it is dehumanization. And this is done even like through, if you take a look at like probation, like it's sold as like it's helping. It's a bureaucratic thing, but it's actually surveillance by another name. And like homeless sweeps, we have that a lot in Lane County, in Eugene, where, our number of homelessness is disproportionate to, others around the area. They call them like cleanups, but it's actually just forced displacement. So this bureaucratic thing that we have inside us, inside of the capitalist system that we have, is kind of providing this. And I really loved a quote from Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez in 2019, where she said the term family housing unit is used in place of detention center, as if walls disappear when words are softened. I loved it. I thought that it really spoke well to this entire topic. So yeah, I guess like what kind of systems are we normalizing simply because paperwork looks clean? It's like clean in terms of capitalism, but here's Alligator Alcatraz. I guess what other kind of systems do we kind of play around with? Probation and homeless sweeps. Those are kind of like some local things I thought of, but I don't know if you guys have any.
No, the surveillance is definitely part of it too. Like when I was working in the nonprofit sector, I was at a homeless services nonprofit. One thing that struck me is just that in order for an individual or a family, our unit eventually became like a family only. Like we only served families with children. That was also because of a large grant that they got from the Bezos Day One Foundation. Anyway, I'm not going to rehash all that, but the way these things are financed determine how the services are provided, which I guess is my point, is that the place I was working at did serve people experiencing homelessness in general and then changed to families only because a large grant from Jeff Bezos said that you could only serve people who have children. But in order for anyone to receive these services, the amount of information they have to give over about themselves, about their history, about their lives. There is a massive government-run database on anyone who has ever accessed homeless services that has all of your associates, all of your past places of residence, all of this information about your life. You have to give them everything, and they keep track of you even after you've left that shelter and gone on to supportive housing or your own kind of housing. They keep track of you, and their surveillance is part of it. You mentioned Foucault. And I know surveillance is a big thing for him. He has the whole panopticon image. If you've never heard about Foucault's panopticon, that's just a striking image to look up and to contemplate, and as a metaphor for surveillance tech. But yeah, I kind of lost where I was going with that. But trying to remember your question about how language softens it.
Yeah, I think you did. You talked about systems of power that have bureaucracy baked in that actually are doing violence. And I loved your topic you brought up. I think it kind of brought up with the big, beautiful bill. I read that SNAP benefits equally are kind of going to be, or I'm sure other benefits too, but SNAP benefits is what I was reading about. How now it's like you have work requirements and you have to send in all your information to qualify for SNAP, and you have to do it every so often. I don't know, in Oregon, I've had friends that do it, and it seems like every maybe 3 months, 6 months or something. But I read that that's going to be way more frequent. And then, it's like the numbers that you need are going down. So surveillance is just increasing,
And I guess a similar topic, I was thinking, I can't remember who was doing the briefing. I'll have to look this up, but government official talking about amnesty for farm workers, and basically said that there isn't going to be amnesty for farm workers, and we're going to remove all of these people, and we have however many people on Medicaid, so we should be able to get jobs filled by all of these people that have these new work requirements, basically. But the way they were saying was creating jobs for Americans, right? That's like how they were pitching this, like saying like we'll have more jobs available for Americans to do, so we're not going to be providing amnesty. I think that kind of plays into what you're saying there, Arthur, as far as trying to create this softening language to make it sound like this is a good thing when, yeah, obviously this is not going to be good for anyone.
Definitely. And it's easy to think of this as new, I guess. I guess in post 9/11 world that we all grew up with, it's easy to think of anything happening singularly as new. But actually, history is just repeating itself, and history tells us otherwise here. Whenever a state has a need to do something unspeakable, they find a softer word. And we're kind of going to go through some historic parallels, camps by another name. And the first one locally, I guess it's funny to say that term. The first one in the United States to talk about is Japanese internment. In World War II, 120,000 Japanese Americans, most of them citizens, were rounded up during World War II. And the Roosevelt administration didn't call them prison camps. They were assembly centers or relocation facilities, and it was racialized incarceration wrapped in patriotism, which is pretty much what is happening right now. Schools and churches, were essentially turned into holding centers. Families were held behind barbed wire, many for years, and the language made it sound temporary or protective, but it was actually just racist imprisonment. I can go on to the next one, or we can stop and discuss each one. I don't know.
I just have a weird personal experience with the Japanese internment thing because I was visiting my granddad several months ago, and he and I were, I don't know, we got into a lot of, he's a really intelligent guy. He likes to read a lot, and he likes to talk about history and politics and stuff, and I have a soft spot for him in a lot of ways, but I can see some of this like mid-20th century propaganda in some of the conversations I have with him, and I actually got him to read Howard Zinn's book, People's History of the United States, and we were talking about that a little bit. When it came to these Japanese internment camps, he had this idea. I got the sense that it was just in the environment he grew up in and like the stories he got told about it and everything. He was like, oh, well, that was for their benefit because there was so much anti-Japanese racism at the time that people were just like torching the houses of Japanese people and violently attacking them. And so it was for their own protection that they were in these camps. And I was like trying to not let my head explode and have this conversation with him because like I could see that his intentions about it were good. Like he was trying to understand how it was actually a compassionate thing to do to intern all the Japanese in this way. And I was like, oh, that's the propaganda. I don't know how to get you to see that. But he was just convinced that it was for their own protection that happened. And oh, that was a frustrating conversation to have. But yeah, it's like, this is what the propaganda does to people. This is how it justifies it. This is how they find all kinds of reasons to make you believe that it's actually a good thing that it's happening. And yeah, part of our challenge is trying to help ourselves and everybody else see through that and to see what's really going on. What are the real motivations?
Yeah, and many of the Japanese never recovered like their land, their homes, their businesses. It reminded me when I was reading up on this about, I don't know, it's kind of in the back of my brain, I guess, in the media like a few weeks ago, but I don't know if you guys remember this, but some guy tried to get some local immigrant person, out of the country, like into ICE hands. And it was like because the guy wanted, like he had other motivations. He wanted to get the guy's stuff. And that could be a motivating factor is like, here's a business. Oh, it's owned by somebody that I could get thrown into a camp. Like, it's horrible.
Joe, to your point, that's really interesting. I've never heard that before. Like the like Japanese internment camp for their own protection. Like I'd never heard that as part of the argument before. But it made me think of two things. The first one is if you have to put people behind barbed wire, I think you can probably rule out that it's for them. I think that's a pretty good indication. But then the other thing was I was listening to The Daily. It's the podcast from the New York Times, and they did an interview with Tom Hooman, the leadership for ICE, and the argument he was trying to make was like a lot of people die trying to come to the United States. Like I've seen like from human trafficking perspective as they're kind of coming across the border, I've seen dead children, I've seen dead, and he was just going on and on about this. And I'm absolutely sure that there's truth to that, right? I'm sure that there's people, whoever is moving people across borders, care more about the money than the people's lives in some scenarios. And I have no doubt that, people have died like trying to get across borders. But it was essentially trying to frame a lot of these operations as being good for these people that are trying to come to the United States because it'll keep them from trying this thing. And then they won't die like going across the border, or they won't be killed like in some of these things. So it's like exactly what you're saying, right? Trying to frame this as being good for the people that are involved or that, want to come to the United States and may do so without going through the normal immigration channels.
Yeah, it kind of shifts the blame onto like the public too there. It's like, they're only in here because of you versus. Ugh. Another comparison historically is Soviet gulags. The USSR imprisoned millions under the term of corrective labor colonies. They weren't job training programs, they were actually forced labor camps where people, especially political dissidents, stay tuned for our future, endured starvation, torture, and execution. And the word corrective makes it sound like reform, but it was punishment on an industrial scale. And then kind of like shifting to, how this is taken in a modern approach in giant states, one that I have personal like ethical issues with is the Alligator detention camps in China, in the Xinjiang province. Who knows if I pronounce that correctly? The Chinese, calls these, vocational training centers. And in reality, they're high security indoctrination camps with 24/7 surveillance. It's forced labor. There's ideological control. And many of today's fashion supply chains rely on these factories. Nike, along with Apple, along with Coca-Cola, along with other companies have been called out for using these camps. And sometimes when I'm in the store, it'll like literally, when you look at a piece of clothing, it's like made in the Xinjiang province of China. That's when I don't buy it. And so when you hear, re-education, remember, it's actually all kind of about supply chains and exploitation and profit, and it's branded as humanitarian uplifting. And that's kind of what we have today in the US with ICE, where they call these facilities, quote, soft-sided facilities as though they're temporary, family housing, processing centers. This language masks the fact that it's been and will continue to be indefinite detention, illegal limbo, family separation, and deeply privatized, often abusive holding systems. And there are companies making billions providing logistics and surveillance under these euphemisms, which we'll get into. But across empires, we have this kind of like capitalist, communist, authoritarian, or liberal. It doesn't matter. Like the logic is the same. The control narrative is the same. I don't mean to say it's not the same if it is communist. It's what we have called communist, I guess, with the Soviets. But it's like masking the violence and monetizing the machinery. So that's kind of like historical perspective on these and how it is kind of still currently playing out today.
I love how you're connecting the sort of global network of exploitation and how intertwined it all is. Just reminded me of a random video I came across of some guy from China who posts propaganda and stuff. And someone was in his comments talking about how, oh, I thought China was a communist country. And he came back like, yeah, it's propaganda. Just like America says it's a democracy, but not really. China says it's communist, but not really. And how these systems use language to convince us that they're one thing, and they're all just sort of colluding to create an increased profit for themselves. And like the American capitalists are deeply in bed with the people that right-wing politicians claim to hate. And like just this whole cycle of abuse and exploitation is just so globalized now, so all over the place and deeply intertwined. And yes, back to your point, like who is profiting from all this stuff? Are there private corporations, perhaps, behind all this stuff? I remember a striking moment in A People's History of the United States when he's talking about the Trail of Tears, and the U.S. government hired contractors to provide food and supplies for the indigenous people as they were being forcibly moved out west. And shockingly, the contractor did a terrible job, and tons of people starved and died on the way, and the contractor just raked in tons and tons of money from the government. And you can see the same thing happening now with contractors in bed with the U.S. government behind the scenes of all this exploitation going on. Again, we're facing some of the same problems we have been for a long time. It's just different technology and a different context.
Well, on that point, Joe, Alligator Alcatraz, there's been reporting on that's coming out. I don't know if it's been, multi-sourced or not, but I saw it the other day. It was basically like, yeah, the conditions inside those tents, like they did this whole walkthrough, right? And be like, oh, here's the showers, here's all this like things, but like real life conditions in there, like they're not getting like meals, like or like one meal a day, and it's like substandard food, and it's like all of it, like same exact thing. Like who built these things? Like a contractor out like to the Florida government or whatnot, and cutting costs and not. I mean, it's the same exact thing.
And to Joe's earlier point, it's like, what is the goal? If we were in some sort of Netherlands kind of country, the goal would be rehabilitation of, well, first of all, they wouldn't even be there. But if people were there for any sort of criminal reason, the goal would be rehabilitation. So what's the goal here? Okay.
Please stay tuned for a word from our sponsors. Do you work for ICE, a detention contractor, or process deportation paperwork from a laptop in Ohio? Ever feel weird about it?
You may be suffering from bureaucratic conscience fatigue. That's why we made Call Me Gone, a once daily tablet for ethical discomfort caused by complicity in mass dehumanization.
Each pill is packed with time-release euphemisms like policy compliance, logistical necessity, and orderly processing environment.
No more guilt, no more reflection. When history knocks, you'll be too sedated to answer.
Side effects may include moral numbness, job promotions, and total detachment. Do not take Comic-Con if you still possess a conscience.
Well, this next section, I took inspo from Joe. I really loved your last outline where you ask and answer these questions around abuses at home, abuses abroad, who's profiting. So I tried to tie some of that in. I thought about abuses abroad and at home, and kind of like the global logic of disappearance that has become made into a brand new, well, not a new market, but it's an existing market of capitalism that profits. And I thought about South America because in like El Salvador and Guatemala, Honduras, these places where we are sending people today, and kind of wanted to flush out what we have done there. So zooming out, the U.S. doesn't just cage people inside its borders. It actually builds the blueprint abroad, and then it does it at home. And in 2023, the Biden administration touted new migration partnerships with Latin American countries. But under the banner were millions in contracts for biometric data collection, detention construction, and joint enforcement training. It's not actually humanitarian aid as it was poised, it's actually detention outsourcing. In 2021, Secretary of State Antony Blinken praised the Merida Initiative evolutions into a, quote, shared vision for security cooperation, end quote. Behind this is U.S.-funded military units conducting migrant crackdowns and infrastructure modeled after ICE holding centers that we have today and in the past. Biometric data and joint enforcement training. And it's really been like since the early 2000s, the U.S. has funded border militarization and detention systems across Latin America under the names of like security assistance, counter-narcotics aid, or development partnerships. And these programs sound humanitarian, but they often mean paramilitary raids, biometric tracking, and training regimens that mirror ICE tactics. And in Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador, U.S. dollars have funded these detention centers stylized after our ICE jails. And in Mexico, immigration authorities are using tech and funding outed through like U.S. programs like the Merida Initiative to conduct mass detentions. And it's kind of like a soft imperialism, right? The cage is like getting exported to another country, but the language is, something else. So domestically, the language that shows up for like community safety zones or reentry housing, sound like social services, but actually they function in this surveillance, policing, lockdown for kind of the poor. And it's not like duplication. It's really, convergence of this ideology of surveillance and control and disappearance, now branded as international cooperation. I really loved Zoran Mamdani had a quote that I thought was actually kind of applicable here. He's the continuation of American imperialism cloaked in democracy. These partnerships don't stop migration, they punish it. So again, asking the question of what the goal is here, we're punishing migration. And we are outsourcing these tactics and kind of testing them abroad. Then we're bringing them home and we're doing harm here. So it's something where there's these other political actors. And I guess, Joe, what you're saying, like revealing the guise of this market of disappearance in capitalism, it actually is kind of global, and there's a global supply chain, and we can kind of trace it, and it ends up in our stores, and we end up buying these products, and in turn, we support it. Just kind of like, yeah.
I was just going to reiterate a point that we've made before on criminality too, because a lot of the justification in the propaganda on the ICE raids and things like that is that, oh, they're coming here illegally, they're breaking the law, therefore they're a criminal. The 13th Amendment means that if you get accused of a crime, they can force you to do labor, which is what slavery is. Like, the more people they can put into these so-called detention centers and accuse of crimes, that is free labor for capitalists to use to produce more profit. It is all part of the same goal for them. But they can try to get us bogged down in like the politics of it and everything, but let's not lose sight of what they're trying to do, of why they're doing this to everybody. It's about criminality. You get accused of a crime, you can legally be a slave, even though it's not called slavery anymore. Let's not forget about that, I guess.
I think that's definitely part of it. But I do think that white nationalism and white supremacy does play a part into this too, especially for people like Stephen Miller, who's kind of pushing a lot of his ideologies, and he's very open with it. Proud white nationalist, right? So I think there is a portion of that as well playing into
for sure,
this,
yeah.
too.
Yeah, that's a good clarification, because I'm not trying to insinuate that there aren't racists out there doing things for racist reasons, but Stephen Miller also invests in places strategically at the same time. Like, historically, colonialism has been very racist. That has done, like capitalism is a racist history. It is people starting in Europe mostly deciding, oh, all these other places with people with so-called inferior technology, we can make them do labor for us, we can take their resources, and we're still living in an extension of that world. And that's what the history of capitalism is racist exploitation of the whole planet.
Kind of interesting. You mentioned Stephen Miller, and then I just guess I kind of thought about this. Like, is there like a thing where like these people who have this kind of like evilness to them, and I guess I'm thinking of Trump and Jimbo, our J.D. Vance and Stephen Miller, like all three of them are married to immigrants. Like all three of them have this like sick fetishization. Like, what is going on? If they're so white nationalists, like, can't they help populate more white people? Like, why are they trying to, what are they doing?
See, that's why I think J.D. Vance is more on the technocrat, like techno-feudal train than he is on the white supremacist train. That's the interesting thing about the whole Trump administration, like the different ideological camps that have combined to create what we have now. And they all have like similar goals in mind, but the why is the interesting part in my mind.
Yeah. I guess signaling like that they're marrying these immigrant, to me, shows that they don't actually care at all about the issue, and it's really just about profit, and it's just about like who's in the room and who's the correct person and who is not, which is the next section. It's language. It's like, it has the power to who gets labeled as a threat and who profits. And language, it doesn't just shape policy, but it constructs who's seen as the problem and who's going to benefit and profit from that, quote, problem. So, from the Red Scare to the war on drugs and post 9/11 surveillance, the U.S. has always used labels to criminalize, dissent and justify exclusion. And these categories inherently, as all things do within capitalism, create brand new markets where people can profit, baby. And today, terms like threat actors or radical extremist or unhoused criminal or communist generate, maybe not that one, but threat actors and unhoused criminals, those generate contracts and surveillance deals. And when you turn a person into a threat, you turn their control into a revenue stream. So we have private prison corporations in the US like Core Civic and Geo Group, who literally rake in hundreds of millions from ICE contracts. That number's just going to grow exorbitantly with the new bill. Surveillance tech firms like Palantir, which has done business with ICE and DHS, profit from the systems that they build on predictive policing and migrant tracking. And shareholders get payouts and the detainees get silenced. And that's it. BlackRock and Vanguard are among the top institutional investors for these firms. In 2018, the Trump administration ramped up detention spending and private prison stocks surged. I literally had family members who called me and were like, oh, I wish I invested in this prison stock because can you see it went up this percent? Yikes. To those of you listening, some of the same billionaires who invested in the Trump campaign also held positions in these companies, building the cages. And that's not just it's not just ideology, it's a supply chain. And it's beginning here with the language and the normalization of that. Historically, this logic has targeted labor movements, Black organizers, immigrants, queer people. Vagrancy laws were justifying forced labor for Black Americans post-slavery. And the quote, calling people enemy alien status enabled Japanese internment. And potential terrorists underpinned Muslim registry push. These aren't just outdated slurs, but they are living in, categories of predictive policing algorithms. And there's a philosopher, Judith Butler, who kind of champions this third wave feminism, who argues that language shapes who is seen as grievable. It's what language shapes who is allowed to be seen as a full person in public life. So maybe if you see a homeless person who has a sign and is begging for something, you might view them as lesser than, or you might put some sort of pity on them. You might see, and in that way, reducing them. If you're framed only as a threat, your suffering becomes invisible. So language kind of, in this way is erasing some humanity, and the cage is being built. And when the cage becomes, an investment portfolio, resistance really means naming the violence and the beneficiaries in doing this. So I think it's really important to name the proper atrocity and kind of demand that we call it what it is. And then two, who's benefiting from it? Is it George W. Bush's cousin? Or is it somebody who, actually got the contract? And no, it's somebody who sat with Trump and had a private dinner for $5 million at Mar-a-Lago. So I guess I don't know, a prompt could be what if we strip away the labels, or what if we identified it? What if billionaires didn't control all the news outlets? What would it mean for an article to come out where it's this is not the case, okay, but we'll just say Peter Thiel profiting 98% from all of the ICE detentions, real numbers, real statistics, naming who's profiting. And would the public be whoa, that's messed up?
Yeah, I'm almost thinking, two things from what you said. One was how do we identify exactly where all of these for-profit prison systems stocks are in 401ks and demand that our 401ks don't have that in it? Is there power that people have there to remove that from portfolios or whatnot? That got me thinking about just how 401ks make us complicit and require us to be participant in the capitalist system in order to survive. But the other thing that made me think about was for-profit prison is not a harsh enough term. It's modern day slave owners is what we should be calling this. And what's the profit that they have off of it, right? That, I totally agree, Arthur. You could say modern day slave owner X made $20 million last year. I feel that's a more accurate description of what's occurring.
It's interesting as you say profit too. It makes me think how we call what we were saying earlier, where we call like all criminals criminals, and that kind of like does away with like, wait, he's in here because he had an eighth ounce of weed versus that person murdered 6 children. Profit should be delineated. There's profit, maybe, and then there's like blood money or whatever you want to call it out. You need a harsher term.
Yeah, agreed.
Yeah, and like, just thinking about Noah's comment in the chat too, the idea that if the government has the money and the resources to build all of these punitive institutions, like literally create housing, the purpose of which is to punish and control and contain, why are there still 500,000 people sleeping on the streets? Why are there over, I think, 50,000 veterans, people who have voluntarily given their service to the country, sleeping on the streets? We have more than enough money, more than enough houses, more than enough resources. I think, I don't know the exact numbers on this. I know I've looked them up for my county, Prince George's County, before, but I'm sure it's true across the board. There are far more vacant, unused dwelling units than there are people who need dwelling units. What is stopping those dwelling units from being lived in? Oh, you don't have the money that you need. It's a stupid system we've created. It's a very stupid system, and the purpose is often cruelty. And not only are we not generous, we make a point of not allowing generosity. Like, generosity is seen as, we use words like handout. What is the linguistic purpose between those two terms of saying being generous and offering something for free or giving a handout? Particularly, what's the intended difference between those two phrases?
Billionaires are owed and the poor are given.
Please stay tuned for a word from our sponsors. Have you ever dreamed of law enforcement but failed the psych exam? Military turn you away for ideological instability?
You're exactly who we're looking for. Join Freedom Enforcers, Greywater's elite unit, filling ISIS labor shortage with people who get things done without that red tape.
No badge, no training, no conscience? No problem. You'll enjoy raids, biometric targeting, and enhanced legal ambiguity.
You bring the boots, we'll supply the plausible deniability.
Clearwater is a private contractor. Just following orders will not hold up in court. Consult a war crimes attorney before deployment.
The conclusionary thought is really, it's surmised in a quote from Wittgenstein going back. And he says, the limits of my language mean the limits of my world. And I think it actually highlights Joe's point about teaching dogs different symbols, right? Like, if you came over to my house and you tried to get, like, my dog doesn't have the same world because the language is different. So if we, take away the word camp, and, that completely erases the emotional weight, the historical weight. And if we didn't have the word for disappearance, we might just be calling it processing. So our entire world, we're just processing people. That's reality. So we have to, identify these things and name the world truthfully to begin to change it. You have to say camp, you have to say disappearance, you have to say detention, and refuse the joke when it is built on a cage. The main thought, I guess, is that, like, if language is the tool, then clarity and uncovering the meaning is the first act of resistance.
Beautiful. Love that.
I thought that was a great summation.
Nice. Do you plug in anything there?
Yeah, I think the only plugs for this week is on Thursday. We've got the final episode of our book club dropping. One thing I'd like to plug specifically on our subreddit, we just put up a sticky post up top. If you've got ideas, we kind of finished some of our deep dives that we really had planned out. We've got other things that we're thinking about and other things that we're going to dive into, but we would like feedback and to hear from listeners and what you're interested in learning along with us as it's related to propaganda or disinformation. So we'll probably redo that post every couple months and just keep it up top so that anyone can always comment in there and feel free to vote what you're interested in.
Nice. That sounds great. I love the idea of the sticky post. That's cool. Well, if the episode sharpened your perspective, share it, subscribe, leave a review, comment, join us on our subreddit where we would love to engage in more dialogue, answer any questions, clarify anything, and just in general support independent media. That's it for this week's episode. Thanks so much for listening and hanging out with us.
If you enjoyed the show, help us spread the word. Leave a rating or review, share it with your friends or family, or anyone who'd get something out of these conversations.
Your ratings, reviews, and shares help this show grow. And the more people listening, the harder it is for propaganda to win.
Until next time.
Stay aware, stay safe, and remember,
Propaganda loves you.